You picture the glow of a dimly lit table. Black backdrop swallowing everything but two figures leaning in across a wooden surface. For decades, this was the stage of Charlie Rose, the southern-drawled interviewer whose velvet cadence and measured silences gave the illusion of intimacy with the world's most powerful minds. Presidents, poets, CEOs, artists, they all came to sit across from him, and you, watching from your living room, felt like you were eavesdropping on history itself. His voice became part of the soundtrack of American intellectual life. But tonight, on Charlie Rose, Interviewer, Accused, Exposed, you are invited to step closer, to peel back that stage lighting and ask what was hiding in the shadows. Because for all the brilliance of the conversations, the story you're about to drift into is one where admiration collides with accusation, and where silence was never as empty as it seemed. Welcome to 102 Hours. This is the place where you lean back, let the hum of the world grow quiet, and slip into narratives of true crime, scandal, and unsolved mysteries. If your clock glows 2 a.m. in Paris, or maybe just struck 9 p.m. in Hanoi, let me know your corner of the night down in the comments. And don't forget, if you find yourself lulled by the murmur of this voice, press like, tap subscribe, and settle in. Because Charlie Rose, Interviewer, Accused, Exposed, is no ordinary profile. It is a slow unraveling of power, charm, and the dangerous comfort of reputation. You feel yourself transported back to the late 1990s, a moment when television still held sway before podcasts and streaming fractured the attention economy. Charlie Rose was not a flashy host. He avoided the glitzy graphics and sound bites of other shows. Instead, he built a reputation on conversation, not confrontation. And in that era, conversation mattered. He had the gravitas of Walter Cronkite, the cultural reach of Barbara Walters, and the stamina of Larry King, all rolled into one. Sitting at his table was almost like a secular anointing. If your ideas or art were worthy of discussion there, you had, in a sense, arrived. But here's the historical fact to keep you grounded. In 1991, just as the Soviet Union collapsed and CNN broadcasted the Gulf War live, Charlie Rose launched his eponymous show. That timing gave his format particular weight. At a moment when the world seemed suddenly chaotic, his dark set and measured voice created an illusion of order. You might even call it the intellectual fireplace of late-night television. Yet beneath that steady rhythm, whispers existed. Staffers later recalled, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in uneasy laughter, moments where professional distance blurred. At first, these were scattered anecdotes, a hand that lingered too long, a request that felt odd. But because the culture around media titans was deferential, few dared challenge him openly. To the public, his voice was golden. Behind the scenes, cracks already formed. Here's the quirky tidbit you stumble upon. Rose famously hated bright lights in the studio. He insisted the set be so dim that camera operators practically moved in the dark. Guests described it as feeling like a confessional booth. That very atmosphere, which made viewers lean in, may also have blurred lines of comfort and control for those working within it. And yet, in this early chapter, you're reminded, no one was talking about allegations on air. The legend of Charlie Rose was built not on scandal, but on access. He interviewed Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama, Toni Morrison, Bill Gates. At times, it seemed every defining figure of modern history passed through his orbit. For years, he collected awards, including a coveted Peabody. The sheen was nearly untouchable. Still, investigators later questioned whether the very traits that made him so effective on camera, the probing eye contact, the long silences, the charm of being the listener, also enabled him to wield subtle forms of power off camera. Was that cultivated style just a performance or something more complicated? You realize that the golden era was golden not only because of what was shown, but because of what was not said. Silence, after all, can be as staged as any question, and so you sit with that unease, recognizing the stage is set for an unraveling. You slip past the polished table, through the curtain of dim lighting, and into the quieter spaces where the real show unfolded. Not on television, but in dressing rooms, corridors, and offices where staff carried clipboards and nervous ambition. Behind the studio doors of Charlie Rose, interviewer, accused, exposed, the picture no longer glowed as clean. The staff was young, often in their 20s, mostly women who saw the job as a gateway into journalism or television production. For many, it was their first real break, and the name Charlie Rose carried weight that could transform resumes overnight. But that proximity to power also meant proximity to something more troubling, something that accusers later described as inappropriate, demeaning, and hard to escape. The accounts came in fragments, whispered for years before anyone listened. One assistant remembered being summoned to Rose's New York apartment, only to find him emerging from the shower, robe untied. Another recalled late-night phone calls, where the conversation shifted from professional to unsettlingly personal. These were not yet headlines. They were stories shared in quiet confidences, often followed by a warning. Don't tell, don't risk your career. To you, the pattern feels familiar in retrospect. The careful grooming of a professional environment where boundaries could be bent under the weight of reputation. A historical fact roots you here. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, workplaces across America were only beginning to grapple with the meaning of sexual harassment. The 1991 Anita Hill testimony against Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas had opened a national conversation, but enforcement of workplace protections lagged. In media, especially television, stars often operated above normal scrutiny. Rose was part of that generation of hosts who were not just employees but institutions unto themselves. Networks courted him, not controlled him. And yet, within his orbit, the power imbalance became impossible to ignore. Some women described being touched on their legs. Others said he leaned in too close or asked deeply personal questions that had nothing to do with their work. One said he invited her to watch him swim naked at his home in Bellport, Long Island. Another claimed he placed his hand on her thigh in the car while traveling for a segment. These allegations, later published in the Washington Post, painted a picture not of isolated missteps, but of an environment where the lines blurred between mentor and predator. The quirky tidbit hidden among these darker accounts: Rose was notorious for dictating long memos to assistants at odd hours, sometimes midnight, sometimes dawn. He would call them from wherever he was in the world, speaking in long, unbroken sentences about future guests or show concepts. Staffers joked they should have been paid by the word. To some, those calls were exhilarating, proof they were trusted. To others, especially when the conversation veered, they became a source of dread. You pause on this thought. Investigators still question whether the studio environment itself, dim, intimate, carefully staged, was not just aesthetic, but tactical. Did it normalize closeness, making resistance harder to articulate? Or was it simply a stylistic flourish that took on new meaning once allegations surfaced? That tension lingers, unresolved. As you sit with these images, the contrast sharpens. On screen, Rose projected the archetype of the gentleman interviewer, the modern Socratic guide. Off-screen, according to the women who worked with him, boundaries eroded in ways that left them feeling trapped between ambition and discomfort. For years, those accounts remained hidden behind the studio doors, but whispers, like cracks, eventually spread. And in 2017, the silence finally shattered. You remember the day vividly, November 20th, 2017. Your newsfeed erupted with a headline from the Washington Post that seemed almost unthinkable. 8 women accused Charlie Rose of sexual harassment, spanning from the late 1990s to 2011. For decades, you had watched him interview world leaders with a cool, unshakable presence. And now you were reading about allegations of lewd calls, unwanted groping, and moments of nudity that shattered that carefully built image. This wasn't just another story in the wave of non-cog Me Too. It was a reckoning for a man whose entire persona had been crafted around curiosity, trust, and listening. The Post article dropped like a bombshell. One woman described being touched on her thigh during a car ride. Another recalled being summoned to his home, only to find him emerging naked from the shower. Several remembered phone calls that began as work-related and veered into sexual territory. All painted a pattern of behavior that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. And yet, here is the crucial legal fact you can ignore. Rose was never charged with a crime. These remained allegations, credible, consistent, but untested in criminal court. He issued a public apology that same day, acknowledging he behaved insensitively, but also insisting he believed he was pursuing shared feelings. It was an apology that landed as hollow for many, especially those who had waited years to be heard. Step back for a moment and you realize the timing was no accident. In October 2017, just weeks before, the New York Times and the New Yorker published bombshell investigations into Harvey Weinstein, igniting the Me Too movement into global fire. The public mood had shifted. Allegations that might have once been buried or dismissed suddenly found space to breathe. When the Rose article appeared, it was not only news, it was part of a cultural avalanche. And here's your quirky tidbit. On the morning the allegations broke, Rose was supposed to interview an author about power and ethics in modern America. Instead, his own ethics became the subject. His absence on set that day was almost surreal, like a stage missing its central prop. Colleagues on CBS This Morning, Gayle King and Norah O'Donnell, opened the broadcast visibly shaken, their voices trembling as they condemned his alleged behavior. For a show built on chemistry, the fracture was public and raw. But investigators still question whether the media environment that had long celebrated Rose helped protect him until that moment. The allegations spanned over a decade. Whispers existed long before the Post article. Why did it take so long for anyone to listen? Was it the culture of deference to powerful men in media? Or simply the lack of a tipping point until Me Too? The answer remains unsettled. As you scroll through memories of that week, the speed of collapse feels dizzying. Rose went from being an institution to being an exile in less than 48 hours. His name, once synonymous with intellectual prestige, was now linked to scandal. The first allegations had surfaced, and nothing would ever be the same again. You blink, and it feels as though the empire collapses overnight. One day, Charlie Rose is the measured voice of CBS This Morning, the midnight philosopher of PBS, the Bloomberg mainstay for business and politics. The next, those very networks are scrubbing his name from their schedules. In Charlie Rose, interviewer, accused, exposed, this moment is less a slow decline and more a cliff. The speed is breathtaking. On November 20th, 2017, hours after the Washington Post article appeared, CBS suspended him. By the next morning, the suspension was termination. PBS and Bloomberg followed quickly, both announcing they would stop distributing his long-running interview show. That same table, the glossy, dark stage that had hosted everyone from Toni Morrison to Barack Obama, went dark, not with ceremony but with sudden absence. For decades, television networks had built him into an institution. Now they raced to distance themselves. A historical fact sharpens this collapse. In 2017, CBS was already under scrutiny for its handling of sexual harassment claims within the company. Les Moonves, the CEO, would himself face allegations less than a year later. Networks understood that inaction could no longer be tolerated. The swift cutting of ties with Rose was both a moral gesture and a strategic one. In the climate of Me Too, hesitation risked reputational damage that no company wanted to shoulder. And yet, there was a kind of eerie silence around the end. PBS, which had aired Charlie Rose since 1993, simply announced it was severing ties and replaced his slot with reruns of other programming. Bloomberg pulled his clips from their site. There was no farewell broadcast, no reflective montage, no goodbye to loyal viewers. Just a vanishing. If you tuned in a week later, you would find the space filled by something else, as though his decades of influence had evaporated. Here's your quirky tidbit. Rose S. nameplate on his office door at CBS was reportedly removed within hours of the termination. Colleagues described walking past the suddenly blank space, an uncanny reminder of how quickly an icon can be erased. The same building that had once whispered with his presence now carried the sound of a door shut tight. Still, investigators question whether networks acted swiftly because of morality or because of liability. After all, the allegations spanned years. Years when whispers were circulating. Years when rumors reached management. Did they truly not know, or did they choose not to look? This unresolved question hovers like smoke over the narrative. To you, watching from afar, the abruptness was jarring. For so long, his presence felt permanent, woven into the daily fabric of media. And then, nothing. A man who once spoke to the world nightly was suddenly denied even a sign-off. The networks cut ties, yes, but in the silence left behind, you hear another sound. The beginning of lawsuits, of survivors stepping forward with more than whispers. Because when institutions retreat, individuals often advance.
You feel the shift as whispers become formal complaints folded into crisp legal filings stamped by a court clerk. It is May 2018, only months after the Washington Post's, when 3 women step into the public record with their names attached. Catherine Brooks Harris, Sydney McNeil, and King Chelsea Way. They are not faceless accusers anymore, they are plaintiffs. And their lawsuit against Charlie Rose and CBS marks a turning point in Charlie Rose interviewer, accused, exposed. Allegations move from the court of public opinion to the actual court system. Each of the women had worked in proximity to Rose as assistants, coordinators, or entry-level staff, and each described encounters they believed crossed professional lines. Harris alleged that Rose made sexual comments and attempted unwanted physical contact. McNeil said she endured lewd remarks and physical advances while working on his team. Way, who was younger, claimed that she faced both harassment and retaliation when she complained, alleging she was demoted after resisting his behavior. Their lawsuit didn't just target Rose himself, it named CBS as a co-defendant, accusing the network of enabling his conduct by turning a blind eye. A historical fact sets the legal frame. In 2018, the #MeToo movement was at its apex, reshaping workplace policies across industries. Corporations scrambled to establish hotlines, conduct trainings, and protect their reputations. For CBS, the lawsuit arrived at a particularly sensitive moment, as its leadership was already under scrutiny. Within months, CEO Les Moonves would face his own downfall. To the public, the network looked less like an unwitting bystander and more like a company with a systemic problem. The plaintiffs described concrete scenarios: Rose touching their thighs, Rose making sexual jokes during work conversations, Rose walking round naked in their presence. They alleged a workplace where boundaries were repeatedly crossed and where complaints were not taken seriously. For them, the lawsuit wasn't just about damages. It was about accountability, about putting on record what had long been whispered. Here's your quirky tidbit. Despite the seriousness of the claims, Rose still owned a sprawling Sherrill Mount estate in North Carolina at the time, complete with horse barns and expansive gardens. Locals described seeing him tending to flowers or walking along trails, a pastoral image at odds with the allegations circling in legal documents. The contrast between the quiet countryside retreat and the storm in Manhattan courtrooms could not have been sharper. Investigators still question whether CBS should have known earlier. Internal staff memos hinted at rumors, and former employees told reporters they had raised concerns informally. Was the company negligent or complicit? Did executives turn away because Rose brought prestige and ratings? These questions remain contested, with no definitive answers. For you, following along, the lawsuit trio felt like the first formal challenge to an institution. It was no longer just about a powerful interviewer's alleged conduct. It was about whether a network trusted to deliver news and information had protected its viewers at the expense of its staff. The case would stretch on for years, winding through motions and negotiations. But in 2018, its filing was a declaration. The era of silence had ended. You blink, and suddenly years have passed since the first explosive headlines. The roar of the #MeToo moment has softened into a steady hum. Court calendars have shifted. Lawyers have filed motions in triplicate. And then, in November 2024, a quiet headline slips out. Charlie Rose and CBS have settled the lawsuit filed by Catherine Brooks Harris, Sidney McNeil, and King Chelsea Way. No trial, no jury, no sworn testimony under the bright lights of a courtroom, just a settlement. Confidential, sealed, final. In Charlie Rose, interviewer accused, exposed. This is the chapter where resolution comes, not with thunder, but with whispers. The women issued a joint statement, careful, measured, loyally. They said they did not assign ill intent to Rose, but maintained their interpretations of events differed. That phrasing, so delicately constructed, speaks volumes. It was the language of compromise, not vindication. Rose, for his part, offered no public reflection beyond the agreement. For the plaintiffs, it closed one chapter of their lives, even if the ending was less than cinematic. For Rose, it meant avoiding trial, but not erasing the stain. A historical fact anchors this ending. Settlements are common in civil harassment cases. Roughly 70% of employment-related harassment claims are resolved outside court. Often because trials are grueling, unpredictable, and public. Settlements provide closure, even if incomplete. Still, they rarely deliver clarity for the public. The truth remains suspended in a gray zone between legal acknowledgement and private compromise. Meanwhile, CBS had already undergone its own reckoning. By 2018, CEO Les Moonves had been ousted amid harassment allegations. And the network created new oversight mechanisms. To settle with the Rose accusers was another step in its corporate cleanup, part of a broader attempt to reset its public image. Yet, for critics, it also looked like sweeping dirt under the rug. Confidential settlements protect both plaintiffs and institutions, but they also protect reputations from deeper scrutiny. Here's your quirky tidbit. During this same period, Rose was spotted occasionally in New York bookstores, browsing titles in history and literature, almost like any other aging retiree. Witnesses described him as subdued, quiet, sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend. It was a mundane sighting, almost jarring given the storm attached to his name. And still, investigators question whether the settlement achieved justice or simply silence. Did the women feel heard or merely exhausted? Did the network learn anything or just pay to make the problem disappear? These questions hover unanswered, as settlements rarely satisfy curiosity. For you, watching the story unfold, the shadowy settlement feels anticlimactic but inevitable. A once revered interviewer had been accused, exposed, and now legally contained. The arc that began in 2017 with public revelations ended not with a gavel strike, but with a signature on a confidential agreement. The audience never got the full story, only the official ending. Settlement in shadows.
You think the story is over, sealed behind legal paperwork and polite statements. But then another voice rises. This time not from a former assistant, but from Gina Riggi, Charlie Rose's longtime makeup artist. Her lawsuit, filed in 2019, painted a different, darker portrait, one less about fleeting encounters and more about what she described as years of ongoing harassment. And in Charlie Rose, interviewer, accused, exposed, this chapter shows how not every thread tied up neatly in settlement. Some remained loose, frayed, and very much alive in the courts. Riggi alleged that Rose treated the workplace as his sexual hunting ground. She claimed he made crude remarks about her body, demeaned her in front of others, and touched her inappropriately during her years working on his show. Unlike the lawsuit trio, hers didn't include CBS directly but focused squarely on Rose himself, alleging that his behavior was part of a sustained pattern. To her, this was not a handful of moments but a professional environment poisoned by power dynamics. Here's a grounding historical fact. By 2019, the Noetiner Me Too movement had already reshaped public institutions. Harvey Weinstein had been indicted. Bill O'Reilly was long off the air. Le Moonves had resigned in disgrace. Yet Rose, while disgraced, had not faced criminal charges. His presence lingered in limbo. Not rehabilitated, not prosecuted, simply exiled. Riggi's lawsuit reminded the world that the story was not done. The proceedings dragged on, complicated by Rose's declining health and the slow grind of civil courts. Reports suggested he denied her allegations, framing their interactions as professional. But because no settlement was immediately reached, her claims remained unresolved, a pending echo of past accusations. Each delay kept the case out of headlines, but alive on dockets. Now, your quirky tidbit, even during this litigation, Rose was said to keep a meticulous archive of his old interviews at his Bellport home. Shelves upon shelves of VHS tapes and DVDs, labeled in neat handwriting. Friends who visited described him occasionally re-watching his own work, as though curating the museum of himself while the world outside debated his legacy. And investigators still question whether Riggi's lawsuit will ever deliver clarity. Would it end in trial, settlement, or simple dismissal due to time and exhaustion? For now, it lingers unresolved, a case file in progress, tethering Rose's name to courtrooms even years after his public fall. For you, listening to this chapter, the unsettled quality feels haunting. The trio of lawsuits ended in shadows, but Riggi's voice refuses to close the curtain. It is the reminder that in these stories, some wounds do not heal with settlements. They persist, demanding to be heard, even if the world has already moved on. You lean back and notice the wider landscape. Charlie Rose was not alone. His fall echoed across a media industry where other titans toppled like dominoes. In Charlie Rose, interviewer, accused, exposed, this is the chapter where his story connects with the larger reckoning of Me Too, a moment that swept through newsrooms, studios, and boardrooms with relentless force. You remember Matt Lauer, the familiar face of Today, ousted in November 2017 after accusations of inappropriate sexual behavior. You recall Mark Halperin, once a respected political analyst, undone by allegations of harassment at ABC News. And, of course, you think of Leigh Moonves, CBS's powerful CEO, forced to resign in 2018 after multiple women accused him of misconduct. Each case revealed something eerily familiar. Institutions slow to act until the pressure became unbearable. Here's your grounding historical fact. By the end of 2018, more than 200 powerful men across industries had lost jobs, contracts, or positions of influence due to harassment or assault allegations. Media, with its spotlight, became the most visible arena. Rose's name was not just a headline. It was part of a cultural wave. And here comes your quirky tidbit. One researcher studying the speed of the Me Too fallout noted that Wikipedia editors created pages for the accused faster than almost any other category in the site's history, rivaled only by natural disasters and political elections. Charlie Rose's biography was updated within hours of the Washington Post article, transforming decades of career achievements into a digital record now forever framed by scandal. But investigators still question whether the collective collapse produced true change or just high-profile sacrifices. Did networks and publishers overhaul their cultures or simply cut ties with individuals once they became liabilities? The doubt lingers. Policies were rewritten, HR hotlines promoted, but systemic accountability is harder to measure. As you sit with these echoes, you realize Rose's story was not unique. It was emblematic. His fall mirrored others, but what made it sting was the image he had cultivated. The patient listener, the intellectual confidant, the man whose questions felt like respect itself. To discover that this figure, too, had allegations against him made the Me Too moment feel even more totalizing. No persona, no reputation, no soft lighting could insulate against the tide. For you, this chapter widens the lens. Rose's name joins a roll call of powerful men exposed during that cultural shift, each case different in detail but united in theme. The echo is clear. One voice spoke out, then another, then dozens more, until silence was no longer an option.
You notice the strangest thing about Charlie Rose after 2017. His voice, once unavoidable, simply vanishes. No guest appearances, no public lectures, no red carpet sightings. For a man who thrived on conversation, the silence is deafening. In Charlie Rose, interviewer, accused, exposed, this chapter takes you not into courtrooms or headlines, but into the quiet aftermath, a life lived away from the camera's glow. After his firing, Rose retreated to his properties. Most notably, his 5,500 square foot Bellport, Long Island home, a place with manicured gardens, wide windows, and a library stacked with tapes of old interviews. Neighbors reported seeing him occasionally walking the grounds, tending flowers, or driving into town. No entourage, no cameras, just a tall, aging figure who once carried the cadence of late-night America. His North Carolina estate remained another refuge, surrounded by trees and horses. more reminiscent of a country retreat than the nerve center of a fallen media star. A historical fact frames his silence. After public scandals, many disgraced broadcasters attempt comebacks, some on podcasts, some on independent platforms. Rose did not. Apart from a 2018 attempt to record one digital interview with Warren Buffett, which fizzled without traction, he offered no return to the public stage. By 2020, he had essentially disappeared, leaving only the archives of his interviews as lingering reminders. And here's your quirky tidbit. Despite the scandal, Rose reportedly kept in contact with a few high-profile friends, including prominent financiers and politicians. On rare occasions, he was spotted at New York restaurants, usually dining quietly, his presence noted by only a few tables. Some described him scribbling notes on a legal pad, old habits refusing to die, even in exile. But investigators still question whether this silence was strategy or surrender. Did Rose deliberately avoid the spotlight to protect what remained of his reputation? Or was he simply unwelcome in a media environment that had closed its doors? The uncertainty hangs there, unanswered, as months turned into years without a single televised word. For you, watching the absence, the void almost becomes its own story. Here was a man who once defined intellectual television by speaking, and now his defining act was not speaking at all, but public silence, private life, a coda written not in broadcast lights but in the soft anonymity of gardens and quiet dinners. You sit with the aftershocks and they ripple far beyond one man. Charlie Rose's downfall was not just about his personal behavior, it was about the collapse of an archetype in Charlie Rose. Interviewer, accused, exposed. This chapter draws you into the cultural reckoning that followed, where viewers, critics, and students of media began to ask, what does an interviewer represent, and what happens when trust fractures? For decades, Rose's show was a classroom disguised as television. You didn't tune in for pyrotechnics or breaking news. You tuned in for quiet, for the illusion of intellectual intimacy. He was the voice in your living room at midnight, making the world's thinkers seem accessible. But when the allegations surfaced, the image cracked. Suddenly, that same intimacy felt dangerous, as though the qualities that made him compelling on screen also enabled alleged misconduct off-screen. A historical fact anchors this fallout. In 2017 and 2018, journalism schools across the United States began incorporating #MeToo case studies into ethics courses. Rose, once a figure held up as a master interviewer, became part of those discussions, not for technique, but for accountability. What had been admired now became cautionary. Professors asked, should students still study his interviews? Can you separate the art from the artist? Your quirky tidbit arrives here. A university archive that once proudly advertised its complete collection of Charlie Rose episodes quietly rebranded the project in 2019. Instead of celebrating the host, it emphasized the guests and the conversations. subtly shifting the framing. The table remained, but the man behind it was exit, and investigators still question whether this cultural fallout truly changed the industry. Did networks learn to vet their stars more rigorously? Did audiences adjust their expectations of intimacy on screen? Or did the cycle simply reset, waiting for the next scandal? For you, as a viewer, the loss was strangely personal. If you had grown up with his show, you might have felt betrayed, as though someone you trusted to guide you through conversations had violated the very spirit of curiosity and respect. The cultural fallout was not just professional, it was emotional. It forced you and millions of others to reconsider what it means to watch, to listen, and to trust. In the years after, the black table became an artifact of a bygone era, less a symbol of intellectual exchange than of fragility. How quickly admiration can crumble when accusations surface. Cultural fallout indeed. The silence after a collapse is often louder than the conversations that came before.
You pause here, in the part of Charlie Rose, interviewer, accused, exposed, where the noise fades but the questions remain. The headlines recede, the shows are canceled, and the man himself slips into silence. Yet the investigations linger, half-finished threads trailing in the wind. No criminal charges ever came against Charlie Rose. That's your firm historical fact. Despite numerous allegations, prosecutors did not pursue a case. Much of the alleged misconduct fell outside statutes of limitations, or into legal gray zones where harassment policies apply but criminal codes do not. What existed instead were internal inquiries at CBS and PBS, alongside civil suits brought by women who said they experienced harassment while working with him. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 2019, CBS quietly settled a lawsuit involving multiple employees, part of a broader corporate reckoning following the resignation of CEO Les Moonves. The terms were sealed, but court watchers noted that some claims involved Rose, tucked into the broader fabric of misconduct allegations across the network. His name was present but buried, like an echo inside a larger scandal. Yet investigators still question whether everything ever came to light. Were there other women who never came forward? Were there settlements hidden behind non-disclosure agreements? The press uncovered fragments, but the full scope may never be known. You're left with an incomplete mosaic, glimpses of behavior that allegedly spanned decades without the clarity of courtroom verdicts. For you as a listener, this uncertainty leaves an ache. Closure never fully arrives. Instead, you're reminded of how power often operates, quietly, without official documents, living in the silences between what's said and what's proven. Rose's career may be over, but the unanswered questions still drift like whispers around his legacy. In the end, the investigations close without a dramatic finale. No gavel bangs, no verdicts thunder. Just silence, settlements, and questions that trail like shadows behind the man who once sat at the black table. You arrive now at the end of Charlie Rose. Interviewer, accused, exposed, where legacy itself becomes a puzzle. What remains of a man who once defined intellectual television, yet whose career ended in disgrace? The answer, as you lean in, is complicated, layered with brilliance, betrayal, and the uneasy truth that history rarely deals in absolutes. Rose's archive endures. Thousands of interviews, from Bill Gates to Toni Morrison, from global leaders to obscure thinkers. They are still studied, still quoted, still uploaded in fragments across the internet. That is your historical fact. The Library of Congress and multiple university archives hold permanent collections of his work. preserving conversations even as the man himself is absent from public life. The material survives, but the framing has shifted. What was once celebrated as The Charlie Rose Show now exists as a record of guests in conversation. The spotlight moved, and the host became a footnote. Your quirky tidbit sneaks in here. A fan-driven YouTube channel, dedicated solely to Rose's interviews, continues to attract thousands of views monthly. Comments range from nostalgic admiration to blunt condemnation. In one thread, a user wrote, "I watch for the guests, not for him," while another replied, "You can't separate the two. The silence in his questions was his art." Ew, the debate continues, even in the digital shadows. And investigators still question whether legacy should be preserved at all when allegations tarnish the figure behind it. Should schools still play his interviews? Should archives contextualize them with disclaimers? Or should the work quietly fade, like a photograph left too long in the sun? For you, the lesson becomes clear. Legacy is not just what you build. It is how others reinterpret it after you re-gone from the stage. Charlie Rose's legacy is no longer just about interviews. It is about trust broken, reputations re-examined, and the cultural shift that demanded accountability from even the most untouchable figures. You close your eyes on this chapter with an awareness that the black table will always carry two stories, one of brilliance and one of exposure. The lesson lingers. Curiosity without respect becomes exploitation, and fame without integrity dissolves into silence. And now, with the story of Charlie Rose. Interviewer, accused, exposed, laid bare, you let your breath slow. The intensity of scandal softens into the quiet of reflection. You've walked through the rise of a celebrated interviewer, the accusations that ended his career, and the echoes that still ripple through media and culture. It has been a long journey, one filled with contrasts. A black table that once symbolized intellectual intimacy, and headlines that later stripped that intimacy bare. You are reminded that every voice, no matter how influential, is still human, flawed, fallible, and capable of harm. The women who came forward, whose stories carried risk and weight, gave shape to a cultural moment larger than any single figure. Their courage reshaped conversations, not just about Charlie Rose, but about workplaces, power, and respect itself. As you rest now, you let yourself consider the value of silence. For Rose, silence meant exile. For you, silence is a place to process, to hold the lessons without the noise of headlines. Perhaps you imagine that black table now covered in dust, tucked away in a studio no longer lit, while the conversations it once hosted float free, detached from the man who curated them. The story closes not with spectacle, but with stillness. And in that stillness, you carry forward a simple truth. Legacies are fragile, and respect is earned not just in words, but in actions. So breathe deeply. Let the echoes fade and slip gently into the calm.